It's great to see so many people here at the last night of the ASL Poetry Festival. So happy to see all of you here. How many of you love ASL? Let's see some hands. Yes. It's great. That is great. Tonight we have a plan to show a short film about ASL poetry and a performance by the wonderful and amazing Patrick Graybill. And then we'll have a short, brief break, a small intermission, and then the Flying Words project will carry on till the end of the evening. That's the plan tonight. Tonight is Rochester, New York's night. You know that? My name is Christie, and I'm from Rochester, New York. Patrick Graybill, who will be performing next, is from Rochester, New York. The Flying Words project, Kenny's from Rochester, New York. Peter used to be from Rochester, New York. So that saved us. This event saved us from our horrible weather. We came here from Rochester and Chicago. Thank you very much. Tonight, I'm going to start us out by telling you a little bit about my work. I started writing English poetry, and I wondered how to share it with an audience. And I wanted to take advantage of ASL poetry, so I've been dealing with how to connect those two languages, how to work within those two languages. The process started with writing English poetry, mostly about my deaf experience and the deaf experience. So I thought, well, there are ways to sign that. And I worked with a partner, a woman, who translated it into ASL and then signed it on video. We edited that material and created a video. Now, many ASL poets aren't just poets, they're also performers. And they're film editors, if you know what I mean. For example, a person might be walking by, and it's obviously a long shot. But if you switch the lens to opening the door, if you switch the scene to opening the door, you might get a close shot. So ASL poets play with that. They don't just create poems. They also perform and think about editing and camera angles and all the visual aspects. The first poem that we're going to show you is Daybreak in Old Hartford. It's based on a poem called Daybreak in Alabama. Do you know that poem by Langston Hughes? So some of you do. Some of you are familiar with that poem. So I thought, well, this talked about connecting black and white people, and I thought it might connect to deaf people and hearing people. So I called it Daybreak in Old Hartford because Hartford is where the very first school for the deaf, the American school, was established in 1817. So first I'm going to show you that film, Daybreak in Old Hartford. When I get to be a smooth signer, I'm gonna sign some poems about daybreak in Old Hartford. And I'm gonna use some of the pure old ASD signs spreading across the sky like the branches of an old oak tree. I'm going to sign about scads and scads of dandelions and their fluff floating on the slow breezes. And show how spring smells drift
with long, reaching arms and calm, peaceful face. And there's a field of daisy eyes, of deaf and hearing, deaf, hearing, deaf people all watching. And I'm going to grasp hearing hands and deaf hands and baby hands and coda hands. And Claire and Gallaudet hands, Alice hands, all joining in, tapping fingers on shoulders and reaching out to each other, natural as vines, in that misty dawn of poetry, when I get to be a smooth signer and compose a poem about daybreak in old Hartford.
Thank you, that was lovely. Next, I'd like to share a poem. I'd like to ask the deaf people, where in the house do deaf people tend to gather? Where do they tend to gather? The kitchen, that's right. You've got the right answer, the kitchen. So this poem compares the kitchen with the dining room. You know, deaf people also experience what we call dinner table syndrome. You know what I mean? Deaf people, a deaf person in a hearing family, when it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, or whatever, and everyone's around the table, friends and relatives, often the deaf person is the only deaf person at the table and all the other people are chatting away and the deaf person's left out. And when the deaf person turns to someone next to them and says, what do they say? The answer is usually, tell you later. So we love the kitchen where deaf people share and talk in great light. This poem compares those two situations. Fortunately, we have Patrick Graybill to perform that poem live tonight. Who wrote it as well? I wrote this poem, and he is performing it.
Yes, Karen Christie is the poet who wrote this poem. And I read it through, and I grew up as a deaf person. I grew up going to deaf clubs, and my parents were not deaf. My mother could sign a little bit. But I saw a lot of my deaf friends who came from other hearing families, and they felt very left out, and that's why I really felt connected to this poem. And it's called Dining Room and Kitchen Table. And there will be no voice interpretation of the poem. And the reason why there won't be voice interpretation is because if there's something for hearing people to listen to, they will. And that just the English becomes a distraction, and your eyes aren't as focused on what I want you to see. And so I'd like you to watch me. Try to discern the mood. Try to see if you see signs repeating. Try to see if I'm using patterns in the way that I use space. I think you'll get the idea. Okay? share with you a piece of mine. I grew up in Kansas. My parents could hear. They had altogether 7 children. 5 of us are deaf. I had 2 hearing sisters, one just older than me, one just younger. I was born 10 years after my older deaf sister. After me was a hearing sister, as I said, and then the remaining kids were also deaf. That 10 years between the older deaf children and me was during the Depression. After the economy started to recover, my sisters noticed that there are all these new babies in the neighborhood. And they said to Mom and Dad, you know, we want some brothers and sisters. And then sure enough, they got them. As I said, my mother was hearing. She used to be a school teacher before she got married. She didn't expect to have all these deaf children. And so she saw how when my older sisters went to the school for the deaf, they picked up signing, and she picked up some. She was never all that good, but she could sign a bit. Now at that time, my father worked on a farm. And during the Depression years, actually he owned a farm, and he had to sell it during the Depression, and we moved into town, and that's when my 2 oldest sisters went away to school. Then I came along around World War II time, and Dad had to go off in the Army. So Mom really was the head of the house during that time, and she could sign some. My older sisters had been going to the school for the deaf, and so then when they would come home Friday evening and be there the weekend, we would all sign together. But during the week, my only signing companion was Mom. In school, I was basically only being taught to read and write, not really sign. I really wish Dad had learned how to sign. But at that time in history, men thought their role was simply to provide for the family financially and let the moms take care of the kids. And that's pretty much what our life was like. I came to be of age to go to the school for the deaf myself, and maybe I was around 10 or 11. I had a really good friend, another deaf boy, and he actually loved music. He would watch the TV. He would watch Your Hit Parade on the TV. And that had the 10 top songs of the week. Of course, there wasn't no captioning in those days. They'd start with number 10. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't relate at all. But he had a book with the lyrics in it, and then he would try to lip read, and I just sort of sat there humoring him. But then along came Diana Ross. I liked Diana Ross. She was a gorgeous singer. I was only 10 or 11, and you know, puberty was just starting to kick in. I didn't know what she sang. I assumed that she pretty much just sang the same thing over and over again, because what did I know about music? Many years later, I was creating some poem. But this piece, every time I do it, it touches something in me, and I think you'll get an idea of it. I call it The Paradox. And I again will ask the interpreter to not interpret. Oh, wait a minute, one more thing, turn your voice back on. You will notice in this poem, and in all of them, that there are 5 particular handshapes. I beg your pardon. There are 5 parameters in every sign. There's the handshake, there's the way it moves. Anybody else remember the others? There's the palm orientation, which way your hand faces. There is the location of where the sign is produced. And then there's the facial expression or non-manual signal that goes along with it. Those are the things I play with. That's enough for an intro. The next piece is a new one. I think I have it memorized, but it's that new, so. It's called My Identity. It talks about things that happened to me throughout different periods of my life. I'm not sure if I need to give any more explanation or not. Well, as far as the structure of the piece, I use the same parameters of the signs and the same principles of repetition of different aspects of signs, repetition of imagery. All poems really have these sorts of structural features, but in the case of ASL poetry, it's all visual. And that's why I ask the interpreter not to interpret, so that your eyes will be tuned to what I'm doing. Here is my identity.
I guess we haven't reached the half hour we were allotted yet. Can anyone give me a time check? It's 8? Oh, well then it is right about the half hour. But I do have just one more that I want to, I did this one a couple of days ago, and it's one of my favorite poems. But first I want to give you some background about why I came up with it. It's called Reflection. When I was a senior at Gallaudet College, I had a part-time job teaching sign language to one of the new counselors on campus at the counseling center. They were a new hire, didn't know any sign language, and so while I was teaching them sign, they taught me different vocabulary that had to do with counseling, like kleptomaniac, for example. I didn't know there was a word for such a thing. And they told me that that's somebody who is maybe perfectly well off, but just has this compulsion to steal things, and it's usually because they need attention. That term and many others. They also told me about the one-way window or mirror that was a new idea, actually, in order for counselors to do observation. So that's what I got out of giving this counselor some tutoring. In November, I came in ready to do our regular tutoring session, and I saw that the counselor was sitting out in their car in the parking lot with the door open, listening to the radio. And they signed to me as best they could, class is canceled today. And I said, well, why? And their answer was, President Kennedy, and then they used the sign, shot. I thought that was the first time in history a sitting president has shot somebody. So I ran straight back to the dorm where a lot of the other boys were gathered around a TV. The dean of students, who could sign quite well, was interpreting for them because there was no caption television in those days. That's when I saw what had happened in Dallas. I saw Jackie Kennedy kneeling on the back of the limo, trying to shield her husband who had just been shot. The footage repeated itself over and over and over again. That such a thing should happen in my country, I didn't know what to make of it. Well, fast forward many years to when I was teaching at NTID. I had an apartment and had a roommate there with me. We were all excited to watch the liftoff of the Challenger space shuttle. I'm sure many of you here know what happened to that. It exploded soon after takeoff. The shock I felt brought me right back to that day when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I felt the way that teacher had felt. So many were killed on that day, including one of them who was a teacher. And when I realized there was a connection between how I responded to both of those events, it didn't take me but half an hour to come up with this poem. Now, there's something about ASL that English doesn't have. And we call this advantage is an example of what we call deaf gain. Instead of hearing loss, it's deaf gain. It's because we have two hands and you can produce two signs at the same time. Unless you were to split your tongue in half, I don't think you can pronounce two words at the same time. Mm-hmm. So let me just get myself organized here, okay? The title of the piece is Reflection. And when I introduce the title, I like to play with the word reflection by fingerspelling it with both hands, appearing to create a reflection of the upper hand. Again, no interpretation will be provided. Thank you. I believe it's now intermission.